All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Simon Lowry. We're at Petit Monde in Portland. It's February 24th, 2025. Simon, thank you so much for joining us today.
For having me.
First question, why wine?
Why wine? Well, it wasn't obvious at first. It's not something I was set on making a career out of, but it's something that was introduced to me at a fairly young age. So I grew up in France with an American dad, French mom, and meals were a big part of the rhythm of our lives. And my dad being an American living in France, of course he had a cellar and was very into wine. So I got to taste pretty young age, which is fairly common in France and not frowned upon, always with food. And always as a signifier that it is a beverage that is meant to be enjoyed like food. That was part of my daily life. But fast forward, going to college in France, have a few friends who also have a similar interest, who grew up in a family where they were introduced to wine. And met up a few times and had a little informal tasting group. We had no idea what we were doing whatsoever, but it was fun, and obviously the social aspect of it was a big part of it, but it was cool. It was kind of an initial exploration of the topic, the dense, convoluted topic that is wine. Finished college, and then moved to Portland, Oregon, where my dad was originally from. I visited here every summer growing up, but initially moved for a sabbatical, like between my first year and second year of master's, and then never left. And then worked in restaurants, as one does in Portland in 2011, and was got involved in music a little bit and worked in restaurants to pay the bills. Initially, I forced myself to work in restaurants where I didn't care about the food so that it would never become more than just a way to pay the bills, but that didn't last very long, and pretty quickly got really interested in working in restaurants. Love the camaraderie that comes from restaurants, many different types of people. I've always enjoyed, being pretty outgoing and sociable, so I had a lot of fun in those environments. And then in working in that environment, being French, both culturally, knowing the language, linguistically, et cetera, wine was obvious. And so pretty quickly got involved while working in restaurants in being a wine buyer. And by doing that, got obsessed with it and really, really interested in it. What you do as a wine buyer, apart from helping guests choose wine, is you also taste a lot of wine with distributors, the job I do now. You learn so much. You taste 50, 60 wines a week, every week. And I just loved it. And so it became my career. Yeah. And why wine? I guess because of the weird vicissitudes of the trajectory of my life, but also why did it stick? I think it's because mostly it brought together a lot of various interests that I had in various aspects of my life. The arts of the table, the enjoyments of the table, of food, my interest in history, specifically European wine is so molded by history and uses kind of the signifiers of history to just justify itself culturally often, and then sharing. And then by getting into it, I learned a new real interest of mine that maybe I already had a few little inklings of getting interested in it, but farming. And essentially this idea that humans can farm a plant but also farm an ecosystem, and that the flavor that the resulting wine that will come from that can be molded by the interaction between humans and nature and history is super, super interesting to me. And I think the reason why it stuck is because of that. So why wine? I guess food and wine, history and wine, and nature and wine, farming and wine. Yeah.
Fantastic answers. I love that. When you went to college, what did you go to college for?
I went to college for humanities. And pretty quickly in France, you have to specialize your degree pretty exclusively. So starting year 2, history. And then I did an undergrad in history in Paris at the Sorbonne. And then there's Masters 1 and Masters 2 in France, which were 2 separate degrees. It's no longer the case, but did my first year of Masters in medieval history, which I wasn't necessarily interested initially in the Middle Ages, but had a professor in my undergrad that was fantastic, that I loved, that looked at medieval history through an anthropological lens, and it was mostly social history, and it was a very different society than the one I lived in, and I was always interested by other cultures, and so did a master's on a court roll of a northern English manor called the Manor of Wakefield, and a court roll of 1306, 1307, where I studied basically the interactions between the peasantry and their lord in the Manor of Wakefield, mostly conflict around property and which all people who were farmers, obviously, because it was in the Middle Ages. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What did you think you would do with your life?
I thought, when I was a kid, I would always say that I would be a cheesemonger if academia didn't work. Both my parents are in academia. My dad's a scientist, a botanist, and my mom was a cultural and history teacher. And pretty early on, I was really interested in history. So either cheesemonger or historian, and became neither.
That might be a wholly unique answer in the history of our interviews. I don't think anyone's ever answered that question quite that way before. That's amazing. So tell me about, you mentioned coming to Portland 2011. What were you'd come up here growing up, so it wasn't new to you, but what caused you to stay? What caused this to be a place you wanted to be?
That's a really good question. A lot of things. I think one thing is I was able to come here, leave school for a year, and put aside the expectations that I had made for myself and for my career. And this was, like right before Portlandia, the famous phrase of where young people go to retire and work odd jobs and just have fun. It very much felt like that, and so the pressure of maybe going into academia waned away by being here, because it felt unpretentious and a lot of people were kind of doing what they like to do, and that was really, really appealing. That was the first thing why I stayed, and then friendships, obviously, music for a while. I played music for 3 or 4 years when I first got here, and then the people, I think mostly the people, the kind of laid back West Coast personality and ethos that is drastically opposed to the fast-paced Parisian one. Fast-paced, self-centered, and fairly rude. So polar opposites. And then I also stayed for a lot of other things. I think I never really loved living in a huge city like Paris. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs, but pretty quickly spent a lot of time in Paris, then went to college in Paris. And then the size of this city spoke to me. And then the mountains, the coast, pretty typical why did you stay in Portland answers, I guess. But all those things contribute to making it pretty nice here. Yeah. And then I'm glad I did, because I got into a lot of other things that I'd never done before. I like climbing now. There's a lot of great rock climbing, the beautiful forests. You have to travel a little further away in Paris to get to those. So all of that, yeah, combined.
So tell me about hitting the restaurant scene in 2011 here. What was it like at that point, and what were some of the first places you landed?
Well, like I said, for a few years I tried to intentionally work in a place where I didn't really care that much about the food, and that was a creperie that was on Hawthorne that no longer exists, and it was fun. I made a lot of friends. But then I bounced around a little bit. I really, I guess something I didn't mention, my French family is from the Celtic part of France, which is called Brittany or Bretagne, which is historically a fairly poor region, but a region that's coastal, where there was always a lot of seafood and a lot of oysters. And for a minute there, I really got into oysters. And then I worked at a place in the Pearl that was called the Parish. That was an oyster bar. And at that time, kind of a pretty good, they were also a wholesaler of oysters to other restaurants. And that was quite fun. And I really got into kind of connecting food to where it's from, also through oysters, which has a lot in common with wine in a lot of ways. There's a funny neologism that people created, terroir for things that come from the land, and merroir for things that come from the sea. Mer means sea in French, terre means earth. So the merroir of oysters. And then the first real job that I became a wine buyer in was a place that was called Olympia Oyster Bar. And I forget when it opened. I'm not very good with remembering dates specifically. But when that opened, it was a really good team of people who were really passionate about food. It was an oyster bar, raw bar, but it was run by a woman who's from Mexico. Grew up in Tijuana at the border, bilingual, bicultural, but Mexican. And I became the wine buyer there, and it was incredibly fun because there was a lot of spice and ceviches and chilies and raw seafood with spice, which Portland didn't quite get back then. Now I feel like it's definitely become a popular thing. A lot of people travel to Mexico City and have experienced amazing Mexican mariscos, as they're called. But it was really fun for wine pairing because a lot of traditional wines don't actually work with chilies. And the classic oyster pairings were great with the raw oysters were served, but anything else that was more authentically Mexican needed a little adjustment. And so working in that restaurant kind of is where I really got into it. And got into Loire Valley white wines, got into German Riesling, which is fantastic with ceviche. It's like the perfect pairing, and still is one of my favorites. And yeah, the food scene back then was really fun. I mean, I think Portland at that point of the late 2010s was kind of in the spotlight of its culinary scene, and was being talked about a lot. So there were a lot of exciting projects. Yeah, and then after that, I opened my own bar with a friend of mine who I met at Olympia Oyster Bar. And we opened initially it was a pop-up. Actually, we started doing these ticketed dinners with wine pairings that explored the food of seafood of coastal France. And then that became a more permanent pop-up and essentially a restaurant shortly after that. And we've opened 4 nights a week in a famous space in Northeast Portland called Sweet Edie, which is a very popular brunch spot, but they were only open in the morning. And we were subleasing their space for the evenings. And ran that for 2 years until the pandemic, essentially. And so my friend and co-owner Elizabeth Pettigrew was the chef and did all the food and made the food menu amazing. And then I took care of the wines. And then we had a lot of close friends help us over those 2 years, including a good friend of mine, Sean Knight, who helped me with the wine program. And that was kind of like the pinnacle of my restaurant career and having an own spot. And it became very popular. And we self-defined ourselves a natural wine bar, which felt right at the time. I don't know if I would today call it that, but it was quite popular at that time because it was one of the first ones around that time. And I miss restaurants still. I mean, I haven't worked in them full time since 2020, so it's coming up on 5 years. But still moonlighted a few because I miss it. The bustling energy of a restaurant is super, super fun. And I love wine people, but only talking about wine with wine people is not quite the same as talking to guests. So I love doing a little bit of both. So I still work at a few restaurants around town, but mostly at one currently called Heavenly Creatures, where I work there like once a month kind of thing. And they're gracious enough to just have me pop in there and trust me. So I'm out of the...
Pretty cool people there.
They're awesome people, yep. And it's a great wine program and cute little spot, good energy. So that's my restaurant trajectory, and I couldn't fully leave it, so I'm still there a little bit, yeah.
Let's talk about being a wine buyer, building a wine list. Yeah. Obviously, you kind of learning on the job in that role. Tell me about starting to learn how to build a list and how tasting that amount of wine. Tell me about learning how to pick out what you needed, what was the right fit, and what you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, it's so like I said earlier, it's kind of you learn really fast because you're essentially tasting many wines each week. So the learning curve is just exponential. I already had prior interest, but obviously had never done that. So I think I inherited a really small, tiny little list, the opening list by one of the owners of Olympia Oyster Bar, but pretty quickly was handed over full autonomy on that and trusted, which being trusted from the business owner and them giving me autonomy to do that was very, very important. It gave me confidence, but also the ability to figure it out on my own without being told what to do, and essentially just flexibility and autonomy. Yeah, you taste a lot of things, and initially it was just one page, and then it kept growing, and the font getting smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where it became 2 pages, and then that happened again. But editing is a big part of it. There's a lot of things you want to support. But I think what stuck for me is I was fortunate enough to taste with people who are wine reps, so essentially who work for companies who are distributors and importers of wine. And I was very lucky to work mostly with a group of 4 or 5 people who were very well versed in the culture of wine and the history of wine, and who also knew fairly intimately the producers that they were representing. And so a big part of what they were doing when I was tasting the wines to select the ones I wanted was storytelling, and explaining to me a lot of the interesting tidbits about the producers, the wines, the rare grapes, the forgotten little regions where those people came from, and that spoke to me. And so essentially those people who were able to speak to that in a well-versed way, people who had visited those producers, essentially de facto became mentors and helped me understand what I wanted to support as far as stylistically and aesthetically the wines, but also their farming philosophies, winemaking philosophies. And so as I learned, I became more confident in my choices. As I became more confident in my choices, I developed my own personal preference and philosophy I wanted to herald and support on the list, and then support on the floor. I will say I did have a person that worked at the restaurant part-time who had done a little bit of that job prior, who helped me. His name is Andrew Wise. He actually moved to Melbourne, now owns a wine shop that also makes wine maps and imports wine from Hungary and Austria. And he had a few years ahead. He was a few years ahead of me, and he worked at Olympia Oyster Bar and helped me out, gave me some good pointers. And then the last step that really solidified things is, like I mentioned, my parents live in France. I go back once or twice a year. Very quickly, the first year I got into being a wine buyer, I started visiting producers. And have done it ever since. So, I mean, it's it'll be 10 years next year. And 10 years of that. And so Hitting the Wine Road is the final moment where I was able really to solidify what I care about. And so to go back to your initial question, how do you select wines? What is building a wine list? I think it's kind of like it's like pointing at things that you think have value, interest, authenticity, kind of like a DJ on the radio station would be, or in a club. I think this is an analogy I'm stealing from a friend, but I think Scott Frank from Bow and Arrow, I think, mentioned that once to me.
Good source.
But yeah, it's very much like that. Being a wine buyer is like being a DJ. You select things and you put them in a new context, and you select things that you think are beautiful. And then pretty quickly, I remember I would do staff trainings, and I remember telling the staff why we chose these things and telling the stories of the producers, because once I heard the stories from my reps, I would regurgitate my own interpretation of those stories to the staff. And I would tell people what matters is I love wines that are slightly imperfect. Perfection, I think, can be a little boring. And I feel that way about most things I enjoy: music, art, cinema. And I would always tell people we're not looking for faults. We're not fault detectors. We're beauty detectors, and we're storytellers. And those two things are what matter. So there is a certain element of using your gut too. What do you find beautiful when you taste? So on one side, the cultural aspect, what do you find authentic? And then on the other side, what speaks to you on a visceral sense? Mm-hmm. And the more I taste on a visceral level as well. I remember my tasting notes. I kept journals of tastings very early on, and early on I would write everything down about the story. I would write a lot of tasting notes that were like fruits and earth tones and blah, blah, blah. And after 2 years, maybe, those entries became shorter and shorter and shorter, and it was very much relying more on, instead of writing down specific tasting notes, it was just kind of gut feeling. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Vibes based.
Vibes based.
I like it. What were you finding yourself drawn to on a personal level of wine, and also as someone selling wine? What were you finding the most interesting, the most beautiful, the most captivating for you?
Yeah. Well, I worked in the context of oysters and seafood, so white wine was a big part of what we did. Obviously, it was like 90% of the list. For those who don't understand, typically in a lot of traditional restaurants, it's the opposite. A lot of consumers, it's a very sad preconceived notion, but a lot of consumers think white wine is probably superior to white wine. They choose bottles of red over white often, so it was kind of flipped on its head. So white wine was what I gravitated towards. Fresh, high acid, bright white wines. So cooler climate, northern France, Germany, Austria, Hungary were like big areas that I was really drawn to when building that list initially. Those things changed over time. I worked in Italian restaurants for a little bit after that. I love red wine, but in the initial steps, that was it. And then very quickly, I became interested in what back then was called the natural wine world. I've already said twice now, I think that I would be hesitant to use that term now because it comes with a lot of, I think, stereotypical views of what it is, but for the lack of a better term, that's what it was called back then. So this was, 2016. I was really drawn to wines that weren't sculpted in the winery to fit a mold, but felt to me like they were given room to be what they are. And partially what that means to me is where they're from. I was interested in some outlandish wines that were pretty strange and weird, but for the most part, not so much. Which is why I don't, maybe if I had a restaurant today, wouldn't use that word, natural wine, which is kind of associated to outlandish kind of wines that are intentionally oxidized or et cetera, et cetera. But on the flip side, I was very quickly disinterested in wines that were very manipulated. And they felt, like I said earlier, manufactured, reverse engineered, instead of giving room to both the origin of where they're from. I think I've thought about this a lot recently, and actually the way I would call these wines today is ecological wines. I think it's a better metaphor than natural, because natural doesn't mean much. And what I mean by ecological is people who, when they farm, try to build more complexity in the ecosystem that they farm, which is their vineyard. So complementarity and pathways of mutual interaction between various species within that ecosystem. So be it mushrooms in the topsoil, other plants, animals. Literally think of their farming philosophy as, how do I build an ecological complexity? And then also I think the term ecological works well for the seller and the winemaker, because essentially what a winemaker does is manage an ecosystem of microorganisms. Grape juice becomes wine because of yeast and bacteria. The human tendency to want to control everything means oversimplification of that ecosystem of microorganisms. The people that I always thought were interesting were people that were interested in not making wine that tastes like vinegar and letting it become totally lackluster and ridiculous, but were interested in giving room and complexity to the ecosystem of their winery. So that's what I call it now, ecological wine.
I like that.
I'm the only one who calls it that so far, so.
It has to start somewhere.
It has to start somewhere, yeah. Okay. And I'm still drawn to that kind of wine, very much so, yeah.
You mentioned storytelling, obviously a huge part of understanding and then selling wine. Tell me about stories that you were drawn to. Obviously, I know it's going to coincide with that, but were there other things, other stories that you found yourself drawn to, certain regions, certain types of winemaking, and what did you find consumers were excited about?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, there's a few stories that pop into my mind right away. There's a winemaker in the Loire Valley called Michel Autran, who was one of the people I visited pretty early on. I would travel to the Loire Valley a lot because it's not too far from Paris, and I'd heard stories from him from the person that I actually replaced in my current career. His name is Tim Ripa, and he used to do my job at the current company I work at, which is an importer and distributor called Petit Monde. And so hearing from him, meeting the person, this guy would use metaphors for describing his wines that were related to music, or I don't know why I'm using the past tense, he still does. And one of the things that he did that I thought was really interesting is he would describe making sparkling wine. So he makes wine from a grape variety called Chenin Blanc. And he would describe making sparkling wine as perfecting one note. And really kind of building the wine in that way. Whereas in his mind, building his white wines was like building a symphony. Both are very, very valuable, but opposite techniques, or at least not techniques, pathways to an aesthetic expression. And I love that metaphor. I would talk about it all the time on the floor. And I thought he was really, still is a very interesting gentleman. Another story that I really enjoyed were obviously all the stories that revolve around these winemakers that rediscovered ancestral techniques in farming and winemaking that had disappeared because of modernity. So a very famous one is a woman winemaker named Elisabetta Foradori. She's in the Dolomites. So the Dolomites are northern Italy, close to the border with Austria. Her and her daughter have pushed the envelope of farming in their family vineyards in an incredible way. She talks about farming in an interview that I had heard of her, where she would describe, let me see if I can remember the quote. I think it was, our goal is to go as close as possible to a forest, meaning what we do in farming a vineyard is to go as close as possible to a forest, because the forest is the best balance you can have in a community of animals and plants. And by that, she means diversifying the ecosystem that is a vineyard. I thought that story was amazing, and I loved repeating it. She's a person who rediscovered using clay amphora, which we're lucky to have a person who makes them now in Oregon who's largely influenced by her. She was one of the first people to do that in the 90s in Italy, which were vessels that had totally disappeared. And overall, I think stories of people holding on to wine cultural artifacts that were disappearing against all odds because they thought that they had validity and that their disappearance in modernity was worth fighting against was definitely like the main story that got me. And I think they're still really important stories. And we talk about them a lot more now than we did in 2016 or even in the 90s and the early 2000s. But those kinds of stories really captivated me. Yeah.
So you mentioned kind of a restaurant trajectory until the pandemic. So tell me about March of 2020 as things are changing. What was your sort of what did you do initially, and how did you sort of pivot into whatever came next?
Yeah, so I was already kind of getting a little exhausted by running a restaurant and working a side job at the same time. I had multiple, so we ran the restaurant 4 days a week, but really, worked 5 days a week because one of the days we were closed, or even 2 of the days we were closed, did shopping, blah, 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 blah. But I still worked 2 shifts during that whole time, so I was working all the time. Very fun jobs. I worked at Nostrana when they were opening Enoteca Nostrana. I worked at OK Omens, both wine-centric places. But essentially was burning myself out a little bit, and already had the plan to maybe find something else. I came to that decision. My business partner with Sardine had wanted to continue, so I told her I would continue building the wine program, but just couldn't be there every day. And so I was already starting to explore other options. And at that time, in conversations with my partner and with family and friends, et cetera, they would ask me, well, what else can you do in this industry? And I always said, well, I could work for a distributor, although there are very few that I would actually want to work for. And no shade there, it's just are very few where the portfolio of wines that were represented had stories that resonated with my philosophy of wine. And that also seemed like good companies to work for. Both those things are important. And one or two of them were at the top of the list, and Petit Monde, the company that I work for right now, and since then, were at the top of that list. And I already knew Olivier, who you interviewed, who is the owner of Petit Monde. And I forget exactly how it happened, but we had a beer once and we talked. And then pretty quickly after that, one of his two reps in Portland was moving to Central Oregon, my former rep, so it just kind of worked out. So yeah, I was already interested in trying to find a way, or at least a break from owning a restaurant, and it lined up perfectly. And initially it was I started a few months after the pandemic, so definitely not the easiest time to start selling wine to restaurants and bottle shops, but already knew a lot of the people, obviously, being that the wine community is a fairly small one, and really enjoyed it. I still get to exchange with people who care about wine, about the topics that I care about. Not every single wine in the Petit Monde book is necessarily like the wine that is my favorite, but the overarching philosophy of the book very much aligns with mine, and the vast majority of the producers I really enjoy. Some I've learned to enjoy even more. Those things are ebbing and flowing, so we're also adding producers. And yeah, so I got to continue to do all the things I loved in the wine world in a slightly different way, but also in a less strenuous one on my mental health, my body. Restaurants are brutal. I'm sure you've heard that in other interviews. And have a life-work balance that is probably a little healthier than I used to. I work during the day, which means I can see my girlfriend in the evenings and have dinner with her, something I didn't do for years and years and years, working in the evenings for years. And now I get to take time to travel to Europe and visit our producers even more. Got the opportunity to do a full harvest in Italy in 2022. Yes, 2022. And so I got very lucky in the fact that I was able to make this transition at a time where the restaurant industry was under massive shifts for hard circumstances, yeah. So I was fortunate. I was, in those initial steps, selling wine to restaurants was still very close to a lot of other people that were into that mess of the pandemic. And so that was heartbreaking to see. Felt that strongly around that time, but yeah.
So obviously you had a lot of experience with reps from the other side. Tell me about what it's like being on the selling side. What was the biggest thing you had to learn? What do you feel like your role is?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, you have to when you are a rep, you are speaking to people that have different needs in terms of their program, have different interests. And I think a big part of what you have to do is kind of edit your storytelling and edit what you show them and what you select that works for them. It is not dissimilar in a way to finding a good wine for a guest in a restaurant, but it is quite different because choosing one bottle for a guest is one thing. Bringing wines that work for the philosophy of a wine program at a restaurant is different. When you're a wine buyer, and you're choosing wines, people come to you, so you are kind of orchestrating the philosophy. When you are a rep and you come to people, you are adapting to someone else's. So that took a little adaptation, not in a bad way. It's just something that came with experience. And one thing that I had to learn was, I think sometimes there are certain people who buy wine who maybe aren't as passionate as me, and so I had to tame that down a little bit and just chill out and bring down the excitement a little bit. And so that was something I had to learn too, you know? I'm French, so we have pretty strong opinions, and it's easy for us to lay those out pretty thick sometimes. So also had to learn how to not do that. But overall, yeah, I think it forced me to be even a little bit more attentive to a more diverse set of wine needs and wine philosophies that other people might have. That is different than mine, which is great. I think it taught me a lot. It helped me be a little less, I don't want to use the word militant because that's maybe inappropriate, but just a little less, a little more relaxed about the philosophy of wine and other people's philosophies of wine. Yeah.
A little less wine snobby.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Which is good.
You talked about obviously the book here is you're adding producers. Tell me about your role in that and how you bring on when new producers brought in. What is important to you to get to know, and are you on the lookout for producers? What is your kind of role in that?
Yeah. So at Petit Monde, it's a very kind of democratic and cooperative process regarding that. And obviously that is something that is created and nurtured by my boss, Olivier. So myself, there's 4 reps, 2 here in Portland, 2 in Seattle. And a lot of times we make those decisions by all tasting and discussing them. Our guiding forces are the philosophy of the book, which is, there's a term in French that describes it a little bit better than the English terms we have for it, which is the term vigneron or vigneronne if it's feminine. So people who aren't just winemakers but are also farmers, and for the most part farm their grapes. Obviously we work with some people who buy grapes as well, but that's a big part of what we are interested in. There's always been a strong interest in the Petit Monde book in championing regions that are maybe less well known or at one point in time were less well known, the margins, the forgotten areas. And then I don't know if it's a defining thing in the decision making of when or not to bring on a producer, but I think ecological leaning farming is pretty important. We don't only have organic producers, but people who I mean, a growing majority of the book is, and people who have those kinds of reflections are going that way, et cetera, is a big part of our decision making as well. As far as my role in that, I'm lucky to be able to speak French, so I've been discussing more recently, although it's been going on for a little while, but to help out a little more on my own as well with that. But I think a lot of my other coworkers are interested in it, so it's a very something we do as a group. We do trips as a group as well. Sometimes it'll be just one of us. Sometimes it'll be 2 or 3 of us. There's usually 1 or 2 trips a year that are a group trip. And when we do those, half of the trip is visiting producers, half of the trip is prospecting and finding new producers. Those trips are fantastic. exhausting, and like it's like being on tour. You just drive from one place to the next, and you taste and you drive, and you have big parties and meals with some of the producers in the evening, but they're really, really fun. And during those trips, we, as a team, obviously find new producers, and it's a really interesting part of the job, and a lot of it is going into the world of someone for a short period of time. Exactly, yeah. And it's fascinating. It's like an interview, but not really. You go to someone's space, you taste in their cellar. Sometimes you'll be invited at their table, their formica covered table in the middle of their kitchen. You'll taste in their kitchen sometimes. I think it's very different than what we might think of as like tasting rooms in places that have a little bit of a bigger setup for wine tourism, like we do in America. And so, yeah, you just spit in a bucket in the middle of a cellar, you taste in someone's kitchen, and they're living, working spaces. A lot of those producers we work with live literally within their vineyards and have their cellar next to their house, sometimes for many generations. So obviously stepping into that world is pretty special. And sometimes it's a really unique, weird world. And so those things are really charming and captivating. And sometimes, yeah, a big part of recounting that story of the little world of that producer is a big part of what we do too.
Tell me a story from one of your trips that stuck with you.
Oh, that's a good one. What is interesting? There's this last Italian trip we did that was really cool. Italy's awesome. I love Italy. The culture runs deep. It does in France too, but in Italy it runs deep, deep, deep. Big part of the reason why is because it wasn't even a country until 150 years ago. So each region has a cultural singularity that is really unique. And my boss and I, Olivier, went to visit this producer named Claudio Plessis, who we met him over dinner in the town, in the city of Modena, which is an amazing food city, with another producer of ours who's a little younger, and then visited him the next day. And the first dinner we had with him was his 72nd birthday. He didn't tell us until the end of the dinner. He doesn't speak a word of English nor of French. So a lot of the conversation was using wine words, having a friend at the table slightly translate. But he was a teacher of agriculture his whole life in the trade school, in the local trade school, and was always a big kind of rebel and proponent of organic farming and of preserving disappearing forms of agriculture and food production. And then in his retirement project was to plant essentially a conservatory of disappearing Lambrusco grapes. So he has like 20 grapes, there's 10 acres left maybe, if that. And then visiting his farm the next day, using our hands and using French to hope that he would understand what we were saying, and then trying to decipher his Italian. And then just talking about life at his table with his wife, talking about art. Was awesome. Eating, I guess, really, really old balsamic, and cheese, and seeing these bottlings he makes of a few hundred bottles of these grapes that essentially don't exist anymore. That was a pretty cool one on this last trip. Truly like a cultural preservationist, an archivist. He's an archivist essentially. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you can drink his archive, which is pretty cool. That's one that comes to mind. I mean, the classic one in the Petit Monde book that all of us that have ever visited are insanely charmed by is a producer called Clos Fontaine They're in the in the Fougères appellation. So it's a small but really cool appellation in the Languedoc in France, where they make wines that are based off of the Carignan grape. And Fantine are these three siblings, two sisters and a brother. They're probably in their early 50s, I think, late 40s, early 50s. But they're like some of the coolest visits on a farming level. They farm this little paradise of vineyards where they have some of the plots they farm together, and then some of the plots only one of them farms. And it's their little experimental garden, and they get to each try techniques of farming that they think are interesting. And then if it works, then they discuss it, and then they do it on the rest of the property. They're, I think, the perfect amount of like experimentation, communal, shared endeavor, and then also they're like super dialed in on the science of soil health, grape farming. They're some of the first people in the south of France to stop plowing or tilling whatsoever. And they just like show you the plants they farm year round and the vines they prune like they're their children. And you just walk around like on all fours, like they pull up like these herbs and they'll tell you about these herbs for 2 hours. And then I went with my girlfriend actually without anybody else at Petit Monde, and then she didn't understand what was going on. But it was her favorite visit of the trip too, because it's just like walking in the Garden of Eden with these people that are just like obsessed with their land. And then we ate lunch that was like, the salad was all from like plants from the vineyards. Like it was just awesome. Yeah, that place is magical. Those are some of the two most recent ones that come to mind. Yeah.
Awesome. Change it up a little bit. Let's talk about harvest. You mentioned doing a harvest in Italy 2022.
Yeah.
What prompted you to want to do it, and tell us about the experience?
So I always wanted to do a harvest, obviously, because I enjoy physical work quite a bit. And I enjoy this beverage that is a farmed beverage without never really been introduced or experienced the physicality of it. I'd done it a few days here and there at some friends of mine in California, with friends in Oregon, a few days here and there actually when I was in Europe or in France around harvest, but never a full harvest. Mm-hmm. So the desire to want to experience, the rhythm, the physicality, the hard work, the camaraderie, all those aspects of harvest, which is a big moment it's the moment, right? It's the one time you harvest the fruits of your labor and the thing that this plant created over 1 year. It's a special time, so I wanted to experience that. And then why did I choose Italy? Well, I wanted to do it at one of our producers. I grew up in France. I have a close proximity to France. I go to France a lot more than Italy. So I wanted to be in an unfamiliar environment and double down on the unfamiliarities, and go out of my comfort zone. I also, like I said, love Italy, love Italian food, love Italian wine. Talk about beautiful imperfections and like just roots and soulful, earthy kind of, I don't know. Italian wine initially is not giving like French wine. It's a little austere, and I love that about it. And so, yeah, also the landscapes of Italy are fascinating. Even though so many of the producers we work with in France are trying to go back to a more complex ecosystem, to try to go away from monoculture, the centralized French history being what it is, a lot of the French wine regions are definitely a little bit more kind of going in that direction and have been for a much longer time. Italy being the history that it has, the fact that all of these various regions were separate countries until not that long ago. The fact that many people who made wine were never just winemakers. They also grew all types of food. The classic, Central Italian landscape is valleys, you grow grains. Mid-slope, you grow vines. Top of the slope, where there's not enough arable soil to grow grapes, you grow olives. And the whole human ecosystem of all these villages revolved around that. And I wanted to kind of experience that. So I ended up at this winery in Umbria, which is a funny little region. It's kind of a landlocked, small region that's south of Tuscany. To joke, I like to say that it's like Tuscany with fewer aristocrats and a lot more wild boar. And it's kind of true. It looks very Tuscan, those beautiful rolling hills, but it's definitely way more rustic. And there's a lot of wild boar. And so, I worked on this farm that's operated by these three friends. They're called Mani di Luna. Mani di Luna is the name of the winery. It means the hands of the moon. And they farm a 30-hectare farm. Only 7-8 hectares, I think, are producing grapes, but there's cherry orchards, olive trees. They grow grains for personal consumption, mostly farro, which is the main grain used in Umbria for making pasta, and have a really cool vegetable garden. And so lunch lasted an hour and a half every day. It was a pasta dish with the farro they grow, milled at a mill on the river, which is the Tiber, that runs right by the vineyards. The mill is 2 miles away, and the manufacturer of the pasta, dried pasta, is a few miles from that. And then all the vegetables came from the garden, and there's a big bottle of olive oil that they produce on the table every day, and ricotta salata that never doesn't know what a fridge is. It just stays on the table, and you just make a mess of the table by grating it all over your plate and pouring olive oil on it, and that was really, really fun. And then it was a good group of people. Worked hard and loved it. It's really fun being in vineyards. You're there oftentimes before sunrise because you want to pick until in the early morning when it's cool. The hotter it gets, and when the suns are all, when the grapes are all in the sun, you'll stop eventually, or we'll do a little bit in more shady areas. But a big part of it is in the morning. Then you work in the winery in the afternoon. Like I said, take an hour and a half lunch break. It's hard to work after that, especially after you have a little grappa. But it's a really good rhythm, and I was just there from the early morning and stayed until the last task was completed, and it was really, really fun. Really, really fun. Yeah. Can't wait to do it again.
You obviously knew a lot about wine going in. What surprised you? What was something you weren't expecting?
That's a good question. Well, when you sell wine, oftentimes you rely on what we call tech information, like this wine was in this vessel for so many months, and then it was pressed this way with this press, and blah, blah, blah. And I kind of went into harvest wanting to ask a million questions about checking all the boxes of all the tech information on every wine, every vineyard, and I realized that it's not like that. It's a lot more figure it out as you go. At least for these people, I think it's not like that for all winemakers, but what is done one year is not the same the next, and what really matters is is what happens beyond those little tech informations, but the overarching kind of direction that is taken with a wine each year. I think this experience obviously was a little different than some, but I was expecting it to be harder. It was physically demanding, but it wasn't too bad. And what else surprised me? One thing I was hoping was, there's this thing that you do when you visit wineries around harvest or after, within the next 3-4 months after harvest, where the producers will make you taste a lot of unfinished wine. And I, at this point, feel like I have a decent grasp on tasting finished wine, but when wines are still in these phases of being dead and reborn, which I think is a lot of what the transformation of wine is. Certain yeast does this and then dies, and others do this and then die, and it's very chaotic as far as like the taste of the wine. And I've never been able to try to fully understand what a wine will become when it's in this chaos phase of being in this fermentative phase. And I was hoping that during a harvest I would be able to get a better grasp on that, and I don't think I have. So maybe it just takes years, or maybe you never really know and you just guess. But that was definitely an expectation I had that wasn't met, but also at the end of it I was like, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, tasting a wine at various phases was still really, really interesting. But I think I just have to accept the fact that at certain points it's just chaos, and you can't know what it will taste like in the future, which is fine.
That's the magic.
That's the magic. That's right. Yeah.
So I'll talk a bit about the sort of the Oregon wine scene, and I'm curious about your impressions of the Oregon wine, we'll call it the ecosystem, the Oregon wine ecosystem when you got here in 2011. Both the wines being made here and the wines being brought in here. What did you sort of think about Oregon's wine culture at that point?
Cool. I think for me, because such a big introduction to wine was through France, and through visiting producers and the culture of wine in France, and being captivated by walk in the vineyards and getting lost in cellars in France. Initially, I compared European wine to Oregon wine, and as a result of that maybe didn't understand it, and I think I had met the wrong people, or sometimes it's just random, right? You fall into something and it's not the other thing. Why? Who knows? But what really got me a little more interested in Oregon wine was having my wine bar Sardine Head, where we had monthly, we hosted an Oregon winemaker. I mean, they weren't always Oregon, but 9 out of 10 times it was Oregon, because quickly, when you're in the wine scene, you befriend a lot of them, and they're an hour away, so it makes a lot of sense. And that was kind of the first time I got interested in it, really. And I was always more drawn to Oregon white wines. Specifically, if you look at the classics, Pinot versus Chardonnay. I mean, although the Chardonnay story is a little more recent here, I really, really liked Oregon Chardonnay a lot. And there's producers that we hosted at the bar that I think make really great Chardonnays, like Statera, Larry's, and others. And then we worked with another producer at the bar that makes a lot of white wine, the Maloufs, Ross and B. Malouf. Really, really enjoyed those wines, and I think they spoke to my sensibilities, to my interest in fresh wines. Pinot took a long time for me, period, be it French or Oregon. Now I am obsessed with Burgundy and French Pinot. I'm still not a big fan of Oregon Pinot. I think there's this thing for me where if Pinot isn't red fruited, but kind of goes into a more dark fruited realm, it speaks to me a little less. Pinot is a very tricky grape. Everyone who makes it says it. And so I'm particular about it, and that's just my own preference. But yeah, a lot of those people that I met were kind of interesting to me. Another area that I really enjoyed was the Gorge, and we're talking about it a lot more in Oregon. But there's some wines that I've tried from the Gorge that I really, really like. I remember Analema was making a few wines from Underwood Mountain. I don't think they do anymore. They were famous for making a sparkling wine from that area, but they were also making a red Pinot from that area that I've loved. Super alpine, fresh, red fruited, delicate, almost restraint and slightly austere, which speaks to me. I like kind of wines that are a little bit like that, especially Pinot. And then, there's a few producers we work with in the Petit Monde book as of very recently. And there's a gentleman named Jared Hadid who has a project named Grape Inc., who is doing really cool stuff. He has planted a bunch of rare grapes on a property where he's also building kind of a nursery of rare grapes, but also makes wines kind of in a weird little pocket. It's the most northern part of the Willamette Valley. It's literally just south of Sauvie Island, almost facing the Columbia, up high. And he's been one of those people that I've been visiting a lot recently. I think his farming philosophy is really interesting. Kind of a one-man band in the middle of nowhere, so it speaks to my interest in people doing that kind of stuff. And then, what are other examples? I think Oregon Chardonnay is probably like my favorite thing for this area, and the classics too. I mean, the Crowley Chardonnays are fantastic. I think we're still at a point in time where consumers, how to put this, so many Oregon winemakers are actually really excited about white wine and Chardonnay, and want to make 10 single vineyard Chardonnays if they could, because they love it. And sadly, it's still something that hasn't really reached the general public, which I think is really unfortunate. Obviously, there's this Chardonnay conversation. A lot of people have preconceived notions about Chardonnay. Oftentimes, they're incomplete because it's one of the best grapes in the world, and it can be a very diverse set of expressions, as opposed to this idea we have of Chardonnay being what it was in the 90s. But I think also, Oregon is becoming more diverse in all of the ways. And is focusing on a lot more things than it ever has. And there's so many more people finding their own voice and expressing that, and I think that's really, really cool. And I think Oregon is doing that in a really smart way, and it's bringing a lot of new people who are finding their own voice in doing that. So I think that branching out is like really cool. And I'm really happy to be around it. And I'm tasting more and more wines from Oregon that speak to me than I ever have. And so I'm really excited about that. I will say there is one little area that of American wine that isn't in Oregon that really, really speaks to me. Where is the other place that I go for harvest every year that I should mention, because that was a big part in my American wine trajectory and discovering a part of American wine that really spoke to me. And it's this teeny little pocket of Northern California, which is called Yuba. It's an AVA called the North Yuba AVA, where there's just a few producers, mainly 3 or 4, but there's more and more of them because a lot of people who do an internship there end up staying. And it's an area, the 2 main wineries that make wine there are Frenchtown Farms and Clos Seuron. I tried a bottle of Syrah made by Clos Seuron, I think in 2017 or 18, so fairly early on in my wine journey, but was an aha epiphany moment for me. It was a Syrah, I think it was a 2013 Syrah, And so I was immediately like, I've never tasted an American wine like this. I need to go figure out what this place is. And I went there the next year and have been every year since. And it's essentially this area that no one would have ever planted grapes there hadn't it been for a post-hippie cult that had many, many, many members in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they basically planted a terraced vineyard like you see in the Northern Rhone, which is an enormous amount of work, but they had a lot of money and free labor and time. So they built this crazy vineyard on pure rock at 2,200 feet. And their winemaker in the 90s left that organization, started his own project down the road, and just makes wine. All the wines in this area are just like pure, very demanding, pure rock terroirs that make like really aggressively mineral and savory wines, and I love them. So little sidebar, but it's a cool area. And then the last thing I should say, I guess, about the Oregon wine scene that I think is really great is that living in a place that has, like Portland, that has a wine region essentially right next to it, makes for a much richer and interesting wine culture. And I think there's a lot of people, I mean, so as a wine rep, I sometimes do public facing tasting at wine shops and things like that. Did one last week at one of the best wine shops in town, ENR. And the level, the level of understanding of the rich culture of wine in Portland from both winemakers, but also people who are just, wine enthusiasts, is really great. And I think we owe that largely due to the fact that we have a really vibrant, really cool wine region right next to us. And that's a way to connect people to the origins of wine, and connecting people to the origins of wine is what makes it interesting, Driving through vineyards and walking into a cellar and smelling what a cellar smells like is something that a lot of Oregonians are fortunate to be able to do. And that's pretty great.
So we talked about the future a little bit for Oregon wine. Let's talk about the future for yourself. Obviously, you've had a lot of projects already. You got your hands on a lot of things still now. What have you not done that you want to do? What's on the horizon for you? I
have this idea in my mind that I've been developing for a little while that I need to put to work. I have a deep love for a grape variety called Chenin Blanc. It's my Instagram handle. It has been with me pretty much through my entire wine career trajectory. I think it's one of the, don't want to use I was going to say noble grapes, but I don't want to use that term. It's one of the very special grapes of France. It's planted in the Loire mostly, although there's a little bit in the southwest of France, that transmits terroir incredibly, makes very diverse styles of wine, from dry to sweet to sparkling. And for some reason, I feel like it's been going through massive resurgence. In France, it's like most wine lists that are pretty hip and cool, they have as much Chenin as Chardonnay, for instance. I don't think we're quite there yet in America, and I don't think we're quite there yet in Oregon. And so I think it'd be really fun at some point to kind of build a little, couple week little festival in Portland around the grape to kind of introduce more people to it. Or that's kind of, haven't gone much further into that, but I think doing something like that would be really, really, really fun. That is definitely something I'd like to do. So I'll have to do it at some point. And I think at some point I will also want to find a way to as a hobbyist and not as a career, find a little plot of land that I can farm with and gain access to a mentorship from a friend who shares my farming philosophies here in Oregon, and make a little wine. Make like a barrel or two for a few years. Maybe if it works, plant a small little 1 acre vineyard, which is fairly spendy, so can't do that quite yet. But maybe I'll get there one day, and I think that'd be really fun. I think that's the next step that I will have to encounter in my wine journey. Deepening the physicality of the harvest that I've had over the few harvest experiences I've had, and taking that to the next level, which is actually farming a row of plants for multiple years and experiencing how the trial and error and little things you do in that realm can create flavor. So hopefully that'll happen. If I did it in Oregon, I would really love to do it kind of in a high elevation area, and probably Chardonnay or maybe Chenin, who knows? Yeah, but white wine, white grape for sure. Yeah.
Future with Petit Monde or in the distribution game, is this something you see yourself doing long term?
Yeah, definitely. I enjoy it quite a bit. I'm getting better and better at it. I have fostered many relationships with the people I sell wine to that are meaningful and that I really enjoy. And it's a constantly evolving thing, so I really enjoy it. Yeah.
All right. All the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover today that you'd like to cover?
Think of any? I think we covered it all.
Tyler told me to ask you about avant-garde French cinema, but I didn't think we had. I didn't think we had time.
We did not.
I think we had time on camera for all that. Get down that rabbit hole.
There is something I didn't mention that was kind of fun that we did at Sardine Head that revolves around avant-garde French cinema and many other things. I think when I was younger, for my own personal involvement in wine, it was very important for me to understand that wine isn't just a luxury commodity, which is sometimes culturally put out in the world in that way, and which explains a lot why I got into the philosophy of wine that I am into, which are people who farm and see it as a farmed beverage. But I really tried to transmit that to the guests that came into the restaurants where I build the lists. And so one thing that I ended up doing specifically at Sardine Head was putting a few words, 4 or 5 different adjectives next to each wine to spark conversation that kind of both made wine seem less hermetic and kind of snobby and closed off, but also to show that wine is an aesthetic expression like a lot of other things. So we added fun tasting notes like various obscure bands or songs or movies. And it was a really good conversation starter with guests at Sardine Head. And I think people really, really appreciated it. And I'm glad we did that. It was really fun. And it was a creative way for me to kind of metaphorically compare certain wines to other things and to help bridge the gap that sometimes exists between the culture of wine and the general public, and to try to make it, more accessible. And I'm glad we did that. It was fun.
Do you have a metaphorical tasting note that you remember that makes you happy?
There were a few. There was one specifically that was really fun. It was a wine from Piedmont in northwestern Italy. It was a grape called Grignolino. It was a producer called Tenuta Migliavacca who makes like very old school, soulful, slightly bready, slightly austere, dark, ambient, inaccessible wines. And the tasting note was the album Faith by The Cure, which is all of those things, kind of relentless in its minimalism and dark, deep, moody atmosphere. And people got a kick out of that one, and it was pretty fun. And the wine tasted like The Cure.
I love that. That's amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with us.
Thank you.
Share your journey with us. We appreciate it, and appreciate you sharing your space here as well.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.